There's a question many people ask after a relationship ends. A question that usually comes with regret, frustration, and disbelief. How did I not see this sooner? What's strange is that, in many cases, the signs were there from the very beginning. The concerning behaviors, the broken promises, the little lies, the warnings from friends and family, the doubts that surfaced from time to time. Even so, the relationship continued. And when everything finally falls apart, there's a feeling that the outcome was predictable, as if the warning signs were obvious to everyone, except the person living the story. But does this happen because some people are naive, because they don't pay attention, or because they consciously ignore what's right in front of their eyes? Psychology suggests a much more uncomfortable answer. Maybe the problem isn't that you didn't see the signs. Maybe the problem is that part of your brain was interpreting those signs in a completely different way. And that helps explain why intelligent, experienced, and perfectly rational people can end up falling in love with individuals who are clearly not good for them. The truth is that the human brain doesn't always seek what brings the most happiness. Often, it seeks something much older, much deeper, and much harder to notice. Something that can determine who sparks our attraction before we even begin to understand why. When we think about attraction, we usually imagine that we're looking for someone who will make us happy, someone compatible, someone who matches our values and goals. But the brain doesn't always follow that logic. In many cases, it prioritizes something else: familiarity. From childhood, we accumulate experiences that shape our view of affection, attention, safety, and relationships. Without realizing it, we create internal models of what feels normal, of what feels like love, of what feels like connection. And here's the surprising part. These models are not always healthy. Sometimes, a person may grow up associating love with unpredictability. Another may associate affection with a constant need for approval. Another may learn that attention and suffering go hand in hand. Years later, when they meet someone who triggers similar emotions, a powerful feeling arises: attraction, chemistry, an immediate sense of connection. But that feeling can be misleading, because the brain often interprets what is familiar as something safe, even when it has caused suffering in the past. That's why some people feel a strong attraction to relationships that repeat old patterns. Not because they want to suffer, but because part of the mind recognizes those feelings as familiar, and what is familiar feels comfortable. The problem is that familiarity is not the same as compatibility, and this confusion sets the stage for something even more dangerous. Because when attraction comes into play, the warning signs start competing with something much stronger: the desire to believe that everything will work out. At the beginning of many problematic relationships, the warning signs are not hidden. They show up early, sometimes very early. It might be an outburst of jealousy, a seemingly small lie, a disrespectful attitude, an excessive need for control, or behaviors that create discomfort from the very first encounters. What's interesting is that many people do notice these signs. They are not blind. They are not completely unaware of what is happening. But something different happens. The signals start to be reinterpreted. Jealousy becomes proof of love. Control becomes care. Instability becomes emotional intensity. A lie becomes an isolated mistake. Little by little, the mind finds explanations that make the behavior feel acceptable. And there is a reason for that. When we feel emotionally invested in someone, we begin to build an idealized version of that person. We start to see not only who they are, but who we believe they can become. And the greater the hope, the easier it becomes to minimize information that conflicts with that vision. The brain prefers to protect the narrative it has already started building, because admitting that the signs were right can mean facing a painful truth. But this tendency doesn't happen only because of hope. There is also a deeper shift happening inside the brain, a shift capable of changing the way we evaluate risk, judge behavior, and make decisions. And this is exactly what passion does. When a person falls in love, they are not just experiencing an intense emotion, their brain is also undergoing real changes. Neuroscience research shows that passion is associated with systems linked to reward, motivation, and desire. In other words, the presence of a loved one can create a feeling similar to the expectation of receiving something extremely valuable. And that's where the problem begins. When the brain is focused on reward, it tends to pay less attention to risk. This doesn't mean the ability to reason disappears, but it does mean it starts competing with very powerful emotions. That's why intelligent people often make emotional decisions that seem irrational when viewed from the outside. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's not a lack of experience. It's the effect of idealization. The mind begins to highlight strengths and minimize flaws. It amplifies positive moments and reduces the importance of negative ones. And the stronger the emotional connection, the harder it becomes to analyze the situation with distance and clarity. That's why friends and family sometimes notice problems long before the person involved does. They are observing the relationship without the emotional filter of passion. But there is something even more intriguing. For some people, this is not an isolated experience. They leave one complicated relationship only to enter another that looks strikingly similar. The names change. The faces change. But the story seems to repeat itself. And that suggests there is a deeper pattern operating behind the scenes. There is a phrase many people say after a few frustrating relationships. I always end up getting involved with the same type of person. At first glance, this seems like remarkable bad luck. But psychology suggests another possibility. It might not be just coincidence. There might be a pattern. When an emotional experience becomes familiar, the brain learns to recognize it quickly. And often, it starts to feel attracted to it. The problem is that the brain doesn't only register positive traits. It also registers emotional dynamics. The constant need for approval, unpredictability, the feeling of having to earn someone's love, the search for validation. These patterns can become so familiar that they start to feel natural. So the person meets someone new. The story seems different, but the emotions being triggered feel very similar. And without realizing it, they begin walking through a script they have already lived before. That's why some people repeat similar relationships even when they swear they would never do it again. The pattern is not only in the people they choose, it is also in what the brain has learned to recognize as attractive. But there is good news. The first step to breaking a pattern is seeing it. And that awareness leads us to the most important revelation of the entire story. So why do we fall in love with the wrong people even when the warning signs seem obvious? The answer is not a lack of intelligence, nor is it a lack of experience. And in most cases, it is not because the signs were invisible. The truth is more complex. The human brain does not choose based on logic alone. It chooses based on emotions, past experiences, and patterns built over a lifetime. Because of that, someone can feel incredibly attractive, not because they are the best match, but because they trigger something familiar, something the brain already knows. At the same time, passion comes into play. It increases attention to positive aspects. It fuels hope. It reduces the perception of risk. And it turns warning signs into details that feel less important than they really are. The result is a powerful combination: familiarity, idealization, emotion. And when these forces work together, even highly rational people can make decisions that later seem hard to understand. But there is an important difference between repeating a pattern and understanding a pattern. When you identify the mechanism, You begin to see what was once operating invisibly. And perhaps this is the most important question someone can ask before starting a relationship. Am I feeling attracted to this person because they truly match me? Or because they trigger emotions my brain already knows? Because sometimes what feels like chemistry may simply be familiarity. And understanding that difference can completely change the way we choose who we let into our lives.